I made 30, that's fine. No, I didn't. And I'll be referring to them partway through.
There's a check.
There's one, yeah.
Okay. Bill, can you see the screen okay from where you are? All right. Hello. Charlie will pop in and
Give me a hold of the drink while you move over. Mind you drink, actually.
This would have been good a year ago before I had my new hip. Thank you.
All right. First of all, Shana Tova, everybody, and thank you very, very much for coming. Some of you I know have schlepped a long way from across the waters, other side of the world there. In fact, quite a lot of you, and I appreciate that. Also, an extra thank you to the folks who already heard part of this talk, a fair percentage of the talk at the COA a while back. So there's going to be a fair amount of repetition for you, but plenty of new stuff too. Basic format that I've kind of planned out for the afternoon is I'm going to yap at you for about, Tracy says 45 minutes, we all know what that means, probably around about an hour. For the survivors at the end of that, then there'll be the real point of coming. There's going to be a musical interlude which, believe me, the trip was worth it just for that. If it calls for me, just tell them, take a message, please. And then after that, we'll have a light dinner, bagels, soup. Tracy made 2 fantastic soups, chicken wings, stuff like that. So that'll be really nice, and salads. And then at the end of that, if anybody's still around, I'll go into part 2 of the talk. The part 2 is the bit that I had to rush through at COA, for those of you who were there. That's the bit about Leonard Cohen's Jewish, the Jewish aspects of his life, of his poetry, and of his songs. So, and that's really the purpose of my putting together the talk, is around that. Now, not everybody who's here this evening is in fact Jewish, so there'll be times when I'll take a little bit of a brief segue for the folks who maybe not across some of the language and some of the things involved, but other than that, that's going to be the sort of thing. If you really are not interested in the dinner, in which case you'd be crazy, or the second part of the talk, and you want to leave, it's absolutely fine. I'm not a person who gets faribald. Sorry for the folks who are not Jewish, this is a Jewish word. I'm not going to take offense. It's not, you do what you want to do. Well, yeah, there is that. But now, just a final point. Some of you may know that I'm actually a school teacher in my spare time, and my classes are fueled entirely by questions from the students. So you should feel more than free. You should feel encouraged to interrupt with questions. You can ask anything you like. You can be as rude as you like. I teach at Mariah, believe me, I've seen it all. Nothing you can shock me with. So we're going to go with that. So first of all, the picture on the screen is my hero, the late Leonard Cohen of blessed memory, and I think there's almost an iconic photo of him there, taken in his declining years at the end of one of his magnificent shows, which I was privileged to see 5 of. And I truly hope could have seen 500, no problem. I wouldn't have had any money left, but that's okay. And this is a little bit of background, first of all, so many of you will already know. So, born in number 599 Westmount Avenue. Westmount is a fairly wealthy Jewish area of Montreal. That house is still standing, although the family no longer owns it. He himself sold it in his later years. His dad across there, Nathan Cohen, he died when Leonard was only 9. I'll mention that in a moment. And he fought in the First World War. He was badly injured there, and he died many years later of those injuries. He never fully recovered. He was never a healthy man after that. Very successful businessman. He had a clothing business, men's clothing, and Leonard Cohen, of course, grew up with that, and as you probably know, dressed absolutely impeccably throughout his life. He literally tried jeans twice. He tried wearing jeans twice in his life, didn't like them. As he said in that interview, it wasn't me. And that was that. He never put them on again. And this is his mum, Masha Cohen. She was born in Kovno in Lithuania, which was, at the time was pretty much regarded as Russia. She was Russian speaking, in fact. And she emigrated with her family to Montreal in the 1920s. She spoke with a strong accent throughout her whole life, but she was a vibrant, very interesting, domineering woman, very powerful, and played a major role in Leonard Cohen's life. A little bit of background. First of all, on his father's side, his great-grandfather, Lazarus Cohen, came from a town in Lithuania also, called Bejish, and he came over to Canada, not to Montreal initially, and founded a Jewish community there, then Montreal. His son, Leon, L-Y-O-N Cohen, was the stalwart of the Jewish community in Montreal for his whole life. He founded and built, saw through the building of the shul, the synagogue Sha'ar HaShomayim, which was the one into which Leonard Cohen was born, where he was bar mitzvah, and where he is today buried. And that was his paternal grandfather, Leon Cohen, father of Nathan, Nathan Cohen, who was father of Leonard. On his mother's side, Masha, her father was Rabbi Shlomo Klonitsky Klein, a great Talmudist, an expert on Hebrew grammar. He wrote several books, some of them quite seminal books on Hebrew grammar. He was known in the Jewish world as Sa'ara Dikduk, the prince of grammar. And it was said of him, as it's often said of these really great Talmudic scholars, he could put a pin through a book of Talmud, and by looking at the first letter on the front page, he would tell you what letter it went through on every other page. Now, whether that's true or not, they say this of these great sages, we'll let it go. The bottom right-hand photograph is of Leonard Cohen in the house that he died in eventually, but you can see the photo on the wall is of his late dad. He was 9 when his dad died. He later told the story that when his father died, after the funeral, he went into his dad's cupboard and took out a bow tie of his father's. He wrote a poem, age 9, and folded it into the bow tie and buried it in the garden of 599 Westmount. Well, it's a lovely story. It was January, and I think anybody who's been in Montreal in January, you're not going to be burying anything in the garden. But okay, let that go. It's a good story. So, and there'll be quite a few of those. Leonard Cohen was born on the 21st of September 1934. The significance of the date, for me anyway, 21st of September is the equinox. The night and the day are of equal length. Now, I don't read any sort of great mystical garbage into that kind of stuff. I just find it amusing because Leonard Cohen spent his life oscillating between opposites. He's full of contradictions throughout his life, full of contradictions in almost everything he said and did. He would contradict himself one week and then say something one week, contradicted the next week. And he lived very comfortably with those contradictions, including one or two quite big ones that we will come to, two particularly, that we'll come to later on in the talk. So I just found that the night and day, the equal night and day, I thought was an amusing aside. There's a couple of pictures of him as a youngster, playing with his sister Esther, who was a few years older. She died a couple of years before he did. So Esther on the right, of course, Leonard on the left, riding in Westmount Avenue. Their house was the last in the row. This is Sha'ar HaShomayim Shul, where he grew up, and that is the young Leonard. So he graduated high school. He spent a lot of time as a madrich at the Jewish summer camps. Pripstein's camp was the main one, but he would go there as a madrich, play his guitar, attract the girls, which was mostly what his life was about, and starting to write poetry. And even in high school, he was already writing pretty serious poetry. Then he went to university, to McGill University, which is, I think, the premier university in Montreal. Certainly it's a major one, or English-speaking anyway. And he went there. He started doing law. That lasted 6 months. It was not a success. And then he switched to literature. And he was already an acclaimed poet by age 19, winning awards. This is him accepting a poetry award for young poets at age 19. And I'm always struck by the fact that you can see the old Leonard Cohen there already. That same beautiful, humble smile is right there. So this was his life. He was always very, very social. He was the center of any kind of social activity that took place. Men and women were attracted to him, but in different ways. The women, I'm told by everybody I've read about, threw themselves at him and absolutely adored him. Now, I'll come back to that topic a little bit later about his relationship with women. In fact, I'll expand on it quite a bit. But it's interesting that even at this stage, it was very much in evidence, his enormous attraction to both women and men. So he published already Let Us Compare Mythologies quite early on in 1956. So he was at the time 22, which was extraordinary to be published as a poet at the age of 22. It's still, in my view, in many ways his best, or at least second best anthology. It's got some of his most magnificent poems, and we'll be looking at a couple of them in depth later this afternoon. But he had a very, very full social life. But because he didn't really have a proper way of making a living, you could be a published poet, but you're not going to get rich like that. His dad had, of course, long died, and there was money in the family. They were an upper middle class family, but he wasn't wealthy in his own right. A grandmother died, one of his grandmothers died, and left him as a legacy 3,000 Canadian dollars. So he decided with that money, he'd been in London, and coincidentally, while in London, he'd gone into a travel agency, and the travel agent was tanned in the middle of a London winter. He said, "Where did you get that tan?" The guy said, "Greece." So he hopped on a plane to Hydra, to the island of Hydra. And while there, he found a little house with no running water, no electricity, no telephone, and he bought it. That is still the Leonard Cohen house to this day, and Tracy and I are going to be visiting it in May next year. We know lots of people. You've been, yeah, Evie's been there. I don't know if anybody else here has already made the pilgrimage.
No, it's
Just a house now.
I think it's family.
Is there?
surrounded.
Yeah,
But the knocker on the door, because of Greek always in these hands, but he's got a mug and dog.
I was going to ask him, is there a mezuzah? But
A mug and dog.
okay.
Didn't notice it.
All right. So anyway, there we go. And he lived there for, he lived there on and off for most of the rest of his life. He'd go back there whenever he felt he needed a bit of a break from everything else that was going on in his life, which was a lot. The life on Hydra was pretty idyllic at that time. This was the 60s, the early and mid 60s. There were a lot of Australian poets and writers living there, famously Charmian Clift and George Johnson, absolutely. If anybody's interested, I have a book here about that called Half of a Perfect World, which documents all of that, all of their lives there, what went on in that island at the time, and so on. It was a very, very interesting place and time to be. Lots of poets, lots of writers, lots of eccentrics, lots of wacky types. A couple of photos taken from there. People sitting outside a tree outside the Duskos Cafe down in the Agora at the bottom there, at the port where the ferry comes in every day. There was a very famous bar owned by a guy called Bill Sinclair there. Bill's Bar was known as, it made it into one of his songs. A lot of his writing references Hydra. I'll mention some of it as we go. So he through all this time he was writing, and he was an incredibly disciplined writer. He wrote every day. He would sit down at his typewriter and write every single day, no matter what else he did. Drinking a lot, drugging a huge amount, socializing, chasing women. Well, in fact, not really chasing them. They chased him, but except whatever the word is, being caught by them. He certainly lived a very, very, very full life, but he wrote all the time. He produced over those years 2 novels. I don't think either of them is particularly brilliant, but some people say they are. One, the more famous of the 2, Beautiful Losers. I've got a copy here. Beautiful Losers, quite a fascinating read, set in Montreal in the 1960s. And then another one which is semi-autobiographical, which about a guy called Braverman, who was Leonard Cohen in disguise. And so the 2 novels were published at that time, and 4 anthologies. So as you see here, Let Us Compare Mythologies, his first one, 56, The Spice Box of Earth. Now, already I think many people in the room will immediately resonate what he's talking about there. So the Spice Box of Earth refers, of course, to the spice box that we hand around at Havdalah at the end of Shabbat, where you sniff the spices to have that lingering smell of the beauty of Shabbat, the last smell of Shabbat. So the Spice Box of Earth is the book. It's I think, as I said earlier, one of his one of my two favorites of his anthologies. We'll be looking at a poem from there later. Flowers for Hitler. Again, you can see a strong Jewish reference there. Not a great anthology in my view. And then The Energy of Slaves, which was quite a stream of consciousness one, and rather a strange anthology. I find it quite difficult to understand most of the poems in that one. Then there's the collection, Poems 56 to 68, which was the selection of some of the best from those four. That's the one I have over there for those who are interested. And then the two novels, The Favorite Game and Beautiful Losers. So this already in the 60s, he's published all of this, or into the early 70s, you see The Energy of Slaves was 72. So up until that time, Leonard Cohen is a writer. His job is, as he put it, blackening pages. He'll sit and he'll write, and he'll cover the pages with ink, and he wrote prolifically. His notebooks there are crates and crates and crates of his notebooks. He never threw anything away. Much of it is at different universities around the world, but it's all preserved. And I mean, nobody's managed to go through all of it yet, but you see, sort of famously, as we'll come back later on to Hallelujah, the famous song Hallelujah, that people discovered over 80 different verses of Hallelujah over the years. He only ever used about 12, but there you go. So he's doing all this and he's writing. And then he has an incident to which I'll come back and refer in more detail a little later, in the harbour of Montreal, with a woman whose name was Suzanne Verdal, Suzanne de Vaillancourt. She was 17. She had married a famous sculptor called Armand de Vaillancourt, who promptly left her. But so she was on her own again at 17 or 18. Leonard Cohen befriended her. There's no evidence anywhere that they were ever lovers. There was just they were just friends. And famously, as I'm sure everybody here knows, one evening he went up to her place. She gave him tea and oranges, etc., etc. And he wrote a song. Probably one of his 2 or 3 most famous songs. So he wrote it, and he wrote it as a song for the first time. Now, he'd always played the guitar. He had a little band of his own called the Buckskin Boys when he was in high school. So he was musical, but he was never gifted musically at all. But he wrote this song, and he befriended somebody called Jennifer Warnes, who was a singer, and a very, very good one. And he gave her the song, and she began to play it, and she recorded it. And if I'm not mistaken, Judy Collins also recorded it at about the same time. So one night, Judy Collins was in concert and Leonard Cohen was there, and she basically bullied him onto the stage. This was in 1966. She said, "Come on, you come and sing your song." He said, I can't sing, I haven't got a voice. Anyway, and he went on, and he got halfway through and he just broke down and ran off the stage. That was his first public performance as a singer. And it was with Suzanne. Later on, he did come back, and it was successful. People loved it. He gave his own live concert, for his first one ever in Edmonton, Alberta, in front of 75 people at the university, and it was very well received. Anyway, people persuaded him, Jennifer Warnes particularly, that it's maybe time that he actually started writing songs, especially because you can't make a living as a poet, but you can as a songwriter. So he did, and the first one came out, Songs of Leonard Cohen. This this changed my life when I first heard it. I was about 13, listening to the most appalling garbage, and my brother, who was much older than I, basically took me aside and said, "This is rubbish, don't listen to this garbage, I'll show you what you should listen to." And he gave me this record, and that was that. So, hooked from then on. So that's what he did. That became his life from then on, was writing poetry for music, writing songs. So in fairly short order, he produced 4 more albums. But over his life, he produced a total of 14 studio albums. Famously, as again we'll see later, the last one 3 weeks before he died. But and then his son Adam produced 1 more after he died, a posthumous one, Thanks for the Dance, which I'm not going to be referring to again this evening, just because I don't really know it well. And it was done without his actual consent. So over the years, you don't need to read it all. I've just put there, that is the discography, those are the albums, but I put in yellow some of the famous songs on each of the albums. You'll notice that I've left one of them off. I put the album there, but no songs next to it. That was the ghastly Death of a Ladies Man. I'm sorry if you like it. I'm sorry for you.
It's my
I'm sorry, Pat. It's got.
he hated it because he didn't like what Phil Spector. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely right.
Yeah, I love it.
Can't stand it.
It's so audacious.
Yeah, jazz police. Don't go with your heart. So it's in my view, he made 13 albums. Sorry, Pat. This one was produced with Phil Spector, who was a psychopath and a control freak. Famously, at one point in the process of producing this album, he first of all took all the masters and wouldn't let Leonard Cohen have them. He said, "That's it. I'm doing it from here." And they were in the studio one day, and he pulled out a loaded pistol and held it to Leonard Cohen's neck. He said, "I really love you, Leonard." And he was, "I hope so." I mean, the guy was mad. He's in jail, or he went to jail subsequently for. Yeah, he was a complete lunatic. Anyway, so there's the album which I don't like, but then there are all the others which I do, or nearly all of them. One, Dear Heather, I'm not mad about myself, but that's just personal taste. So there we have the discography. If anybody wants the details, you can always get them from me later. So at this point in the early 70s, late 60s, he's producing these albums and he's developing a following, not in the US. The US never bought his records, never, throughout his life, were not interested. But in Europe, he took off and like a bushfire, and he was the absolute flavor of the month. Somehow he got himself invited. He had a band of his own that he called the Army. He was always obsessed with military things. He visited Cuba not long after the revolution. He used to be wearing fatigues. He joked about it himself afterwards. But he had a band called the Army. And they got themselves invited to play at the Isle of Wight Festival in 1972. And it was famous. There were 600,000 people who very quickly got out of control. And they were rioting, they were starting fires. The organizers tried to put a fence outside so only paid people could come in. So the people already in rioted. They didn't want the fence, they wanted everybody to come in. And Jimi Hendrix was booed off the stage at 2 in the morning. And the place was in absolute chaos. And then Leonard Cohen came on, looking pretty disheveled. He was high on acid and a few other things. But he came on and he just sweet talked the 600,000 people. He talked them down, and by the end, he played quite a lot of numbers. By the end of it, they were absolutely eating out of his hand. So that was when he really came onto the map big time. That he'd taken a crowd of 600,000 people. I mean, I struggled to control a crowd of 25 per Ryan. And he absolutely calmed them down and turned them back into music lovers. So that really began his concert journey big time. At the end of 1972, personal story. I'm at Boni Machane, a Jewish camp in Cape Town, outside Cape Town, and there was a girl there from Israel called Ruti Hefter, and I mentioned that I love Leonard Cohen. She said, "Oh, Leonard Cohen, she's heard of him. He gave a concert," she says. She knew the songs that he played, So Long Marianne and Bird on a Wire. She said there was a concert that he played at where he got so emotionally overcome he couldn't play. And the whole crowd just started singing with him, and they basically supported him through it. It was such a meaningful experience. Now that story of Ruti stayed with me for all the years. So again, one of those nice stories, yeah? And then in about 2008 or 9, somebody who also Leonard Cohen tragic gave me for my birthday a CD, or DVD rather, of the Leonard Cohen concert at the Binyanei HaOlam in Jerusalem. And it was that concert. It was the very one that I'd heard about in 1972. And there it was, everything. You'll see him at the bottom shaving. He became so overcome, he couldn't carry on, and he went backstage. And then he remembered something that his mother had told him. When you get really anxious and you want to calm down, shave. I've never learned that lesson myself. So there you actually see him shaving. And it's a famous video now, it's a famous movie. It's called Bird on a Wire. So a little bit later, in mid-70s, he met a woman called Suzanne Elrod. not the Suzanne of the song. Her real name was Valentina Susan Elrod. She called herself Suzanne, we think, after the song, to try and replace Suzanne Verdal in the song. Now, side point. So there are lots and lots of biographies of Leonard Cohen. The two most recent, or two of the most recent, are the ones that are, in my view, the best. One by a woman called Sylvie Simmons, which is an absolutely brilliant and comprehensive biography. And then, for me, the supreme one, which came out a few years ago by a Toronto guy called Michael Posner, who wrote in 3 volumes a biography, but it's not a normal biography. He tracked down about 550 people who had known Leonard Cohen personally, and he's interviewed every one of them and asked them all sorts of questions, and then he edits it and he puts it together, and it is absolutely brilliant because they contradict each other. They remember the same incident differently. They remember Leonard Cohen differently. So it's like seeing a real multi-layered portrait. It's not a hagiography. Some of them hated him. Some of them thought he was terrible. But all of them give their views. And by the time you've finished all 3 volumes, you've got a real 3-dimensional picture of who this man was. People who were with him in the Zen Center on Mount Baldy, people who knew him when he was in India, and so on, all over. All kinds of people, from his childhood. His best friend from childhood, Mort Rosengarten, was still alive, and he was interviewed. And so many others. Not Suzanne Elrod. She would not talk to Michael Posner. But almost without exception, the people who speak about her speak negatively. She's not seen as a nice person. But what she did do was she bore him 2 children, Adam and Lorca, 1972 and 1974. And Lorca is named after, of course, the Spanish poet Lorca, who was Leonard Cohen's favorite poet. And he was his most inspirational poet, of which more anon. So that's Suzanne. The relationship, they never married, but it lasted 10 years, and then finally she stormed out. It was a very, very torrid relationship. Both of them had dozens of affairs during the marriage. She was no innocent, and neither was he. But it was tempestuous, but in the end, she did bear him the 2 children. For the first 10 years of their life, she did most of the parenting. He didn't do a lot. Then he pretty much took over and did a hell of a lot of parenting. And you'll hear more about that later this evening. So, further publications that he did over the years, a book of poetry called Death of a Ladies' Man, a fascinating anthology where on the left-hand page is a poem, on the right-hand are his comments on the poem, sometimes very obscure, but it makes an interesting read. The Book of Mercy, his supreme published achievement in my view. I'll be quoting from it a little later. Absolutely remarkable, 1984. The Book of Longing, very, very beautiful poetry, and so on, came out in 2006. Then just 15 poems, that's what it says, 15 poems. And then finally, posthumously, The Flame, which brings together a huge collection of his songs, his poems, his drawings. He drew prolifically as well, very well. He was quite a good artist, line drawings. Often self-portraits, portraits of people. So they're in The Flame. Those books are all here if you want to peruse them later. Flick through them, all available. But if you talk about Leonard Cohen, one of the first topics that everybody thinks about is women, because this was the center of his life apart from his poetry. Now, I want to just put out a point of view here, which will not be a popular one, especially in these modern woke times. The word misogynist, I think, is bandied around quite a lot these days, and it's often used to describe Leonard Cohen as well. And I'm a little bit, I don't agree with that. Leonard Cohen did not hate women. He adored women. He absolutely adored and worshipped them. He was unable to commit to any kind of permanent relationship, in part because he loved women so much that if another wonderful woman came past, he was attracted to her. And she was invariably attracted to him too. So, what is for me fascinating is that reading especially Michael Posner's book, where, I didn't count, 50, 100 of his ex-lovers are interviewed in the book, with one exception only. they only have good things to say about him. They still loved him after he ran off with 20, 30, 40 others. They still loved him, and when they separated, they said, well, they all said, well, I had him for a while, and that was fantastic. And that's that. And I know that you can't pin him down. A little bit like that thing from The Sound of Music. You can't, how do you pin her down? How do you catch a cloud and pin it down? I think he was a bit like that. And women responded well to it, almost all of them.
And the exception?
I can't remember who it was, but it wasn't a great significant one. It wasn't one of the big ones. The big ones, who I'll be showing you in a moment, all still loved him right to the end.
What was his surname, Jim?
Sorry?
What was his surname?
His surname was Cohen.
Oh, right.
Cohen. Yeah. Just you're familiar with his name. Okay. Yeah, I think women are attracted all the time. My cousin, for those who don't know. Glennie, do you still love him? A lot of course, a huge amount of his poetry and his songs are dedicated to various women. When I was young still, and reading his early poetry, I encountered one that just absolutely grabbed me even then, and that's called For Anne. Many of you will know the poem. For Anne, with Annie gone, whose eyes to compare with the morning sun? Not that I did compare, but I do compare now that she's gone. Now, this was written for a woman called Anne Sherman, who he dated very, very closely for a good couple of years, in amongst various other people. But and she still, for years afterwards, stayed in touch with him and loved him. She is the one in the middle. That's Anne Sherman there. I was hoping to be able to get her eyes, but that's the best photo I could find. Now, there they are camping in the Laurentians in Canada in the summer. He's camping with his mentor and his dearest friend, other than Rosengarten, but his mentor, an older man, an older poet, and at the time, the premier poet in Canada. And that is Irving Layton. Now, at that time, until Leonard Cohen came along, there were three of great poets accepted in the English language. All of this is the Anglophone part of Canada only. But there were three poets that were accepted as the greatest poets at the time. Irving Layton, number one, Louis Dudek, both of whom were Jewish, and F.R. Scott, who was not Jewish. He was a professor of law at McGill University, but the three of them were all very good friends and great, great, great poets. And they took Leonard Cohen under their wing early on, but Irving Layton most particularly, and Leonard remained his protege, even though he superseded him as a poet. He remained his protege for the rest of his life, till Layton died in the early 2000s. Now, next to Layton, you'll see they never actually married, but she would have been his fourth wife if they had, out of about 6. But this is Aviva Layton, who grew up in Sydney, and she, Evie, did you know her?
What does it make in there?
No, older, but you might have as a, no? Okay.
Was her name Layton when she was
No.
in Sydney?
Well, I know it's not forgotten, sorry. Okay. Just because Ilona said that she was at school with her. So, anyway, yeah, so she lived with Irving and tolerated his multifarious affairs for many, many years. And she knew Leonard extremely well. They were never lovers, she and Leonard, and that's relatively unusual amongst the women who knew him. So that's Anne Sherman. Other women who played a major role in his life, I've mentioned her already, and that is Suzanne Verdal. This is Suzanne, as the top and bottom ones are her, in fact, as a much older woman. She lives in pretty much poverty in Los Angeles, lives on the back of a ute with a sort of a living section that her son built for her. I couldn't even establish if she's still alive today. I tried everywhere to Google and everything, but the last thing I mentioned I can give of her is about 10 years ago. There's a documentary which she features in briefly as well. She's interviewed sitting on the back of the ute. and that, and but she injured her back and so on, and so she's had a very, very tough life. And in the middle is Our Lady of the Harbour. So this is in the harbour in Montreal. There's a cathedral called Notre Dame de Bon Secours, where sailors used to go to pray before they went to sea for safety. And Our Lady of Bon Secours, and that's her at the top there that you see. So the sun pours down like honey on Our Lady of the Harbour. That's Our Lady of the Harbour. Then on Hydra, he was in the store one day, in the little store around the corner. It's still there, a little supermarket around the corner from his house, buying whatever he was buying. And somebody walked in the door and sort of cut out the sunlight, and he turned around and he couldn't see her silhouetted against the sunlight. But he introduced himself. She said, "My name is Marianne." And that began one of the most famous romances of our time. This is her as a young woman. He said she was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. They went on that donkey ride. It wasn't as pleasant as it looks. It was meant to take them right around the island of Hydra on donkeys, and he couldn't get comfortable. By the end of the day, from trying to hold on, his hands had frozen up. He hated it. But anyway, somebody took that photo. And of course, at the bottom there's Marianne, which was much older. So she was Norwegian. She had briefly been married to a guy called Axel Jensen, filmmaker, Norwegian. She had a son called Axel as well, a little boy, and then he deserted her and went with another woman back to Norway, and she was stuck on Hydra, and then that's when she got together with Leonard Cohen. And she was his muse for some years. Amongst other things, one day when they just put in telephone wires outside the house, she was sitting and she said to Leonard, "Write me a song." And he looked out the window. So what did he see? A bird on the wire. So he wrote it, and that was always her favourite, not the one you'd expect. Her favourite was always Bird on the Wire. Axel grew up, unfortunately, with all sorts of problems. They sent him to Summerhill School. Some of you will know about Summerhill School, A.S. Neal School in England. But he had terrible mental problems and still has to this day. He's been institutionalized most of his life. Marianne, after their on-off relationship for 10 years, eventually went back to Norway. She married a guy called Jan Stang, had a happy marriage, and then he passed away. And I think everybody here knows the end story. There's a movie recently came out, Leonard and Marianne, Letters of Love, which describes it beautifully. For those who don't, she got leukemia in 2016, early in about March of 2016. Leonard at that time was very ill himself and was staying at home. And her friend, a filmmaker called Jan Mollestad, went to visit her in hospital, and he contacted Leonard Cohen and said, "I think you need to know that Marianne is dying." And this was in July. So Leonard famously wrote a letter to her, which he sent to Jan to read to her. The letter says, "Dearest Marianne, I'm just a little behind you, close enough to take your hand. This old body has given up." Sorry, this is going to be the most. "This old body has given up, just as yours has too, and the eviction notice is on its way any day now. I've never forgotten your love and your beauty, but you know that. I don't have to say any more. Safe travels, old friend. See you down the road. Love and gratitude, Leonard." So, again, and if you saw the movie, you actually saw the scene. Jan Mollestad reads her the letter, and when he says, "I'm just behind you, close enough to take your hand," she lifts up her hand. She's half conscious, her eyes are closed. But, and then 2 days later, well, he was playing her Bird on a Wire the whole time, Mollestad. And eventually she stopped breathing, and he kissed her on the forehead and said,
So long, Marianne.
and that was that. And 5 months later, Leonard followed. Here are some of the other women that he had long-term relationships with. The French photographer Dominique Isserman, who's still alive today, still loves him. They were an item for many, many years, very close. Joni Mitchell in the early days, they were an item for a while. At the end, and Joni Thomas, she was the last one, and she was, when he even began his tour at the end, all those tours, she was still with him at the beginning of that. but then that ended. Suzanne Elrod I've put there, and Rebecca De Mornay, who's a movie actress, I believe, and but they were also together for a long time. Yeah,
She was in Risky Business with Tom Cruise.
could be. Yep. Okay, so they were an item for a long, long time. Rebecca De Mornay, she got quite involved with some of his records, with the recording and stuff like that, as did Dominique Isserman, who took the photos for some of them. Suzanne Elrod was a photographer too, and she took the photos for Death of a Ladies Band, the album. And Anjani Thomas also was, she was a singer herself, and apparently a very good one, and she also got involved in some of his later records. So all of them were involved in his artistic life one way or another. But now you're going to hear about something that you haven't heard of before. Even if you were at my other talks, and even if you know quite a lot about Leonard Cohen, you probably don't know about this. There was another woman in his life for many years who somehow never made it into any of the biographies except Michael Posner's. Michael Posner tracked her down and he interviewed her at great length. She was a Costa Rican woman called Gabriela Valenzuela. Now, is there anybody who's heard of her here? I'm guessing not. Yeah? Had you?
A little bit.
Okay, yeah, because you obviously know a hell of a lot more than what you're letting on, but okay. Feel free to correct me, by the way, when except on the Death of a Ladies Band.
Yeah.
He met her in Europe. She was translating Lorca. She was a great Lorca scholar, being Spanish speaking herself from Costa Rica. And so they connected. She was also extremely beautiful. So you can see where this is going to go. And they were lovers for a long, long time. At one point, she got pregnant with his baby. And so there could have been a third Leonard Cohen child, but there were two things in the way. The one is that by that time, he was already moving away from her and starting to look at other women again. And they were quite far apart physically at the time. And the other thing is that she wasn't Jewish. And she knew that he wanted his children to be Jewish. And Marianne, in her old age, was asked how come she never had children with Leonard Cohen. She said, because he wanted Jewish children, and I'm not Jewish. Whereas Suzanne Elrod was. So of all the women that he was with, probably the least suitable was the only one who was Jewish. And so that's the one that he had children with. Okay, one more woman I'm going to mention. She will be the last of this bunch. They were lovers for a while, briefly, but then their relationship became a commercial one. She was his manager, Marty Matchak's assistant. Marty died. Marty was a bit of a crook in his own right, but he died. And she took over management of all of his business. Her name was Kelly Lynch. Michael Posner interviews her at great length. So you hear her views at great length. She doesn't come across well, I have to say. I've called this Waiting for the Miracle. Of course, it's the name of one of his songs. Because she stole all his money, as I think everybody now knows. $8 million, his life savings. She had signing powers and she pinched a lot. He was left with $160,000. When somebody told Lorca, you better call him in Montreal and tell him he's got to come home right away to Los Angeles. So she did, and he came home, and all the money was gone. Lawsuits, blah, blah, blah. I'll cut all that out. The only part that's really of relevance for me, and of, I think, relevance for us, is that because of it, he had to make money again, and make it fast. So thanks to a remarkable young Englishman, put together a show. He got together with his friend Roscoe Beck. They recruited a band, 3 backing singers, his friend and colleague Sharon Robertson, with whom he'd worked extensively before on several of the albums. And they went on tour, starting in 2008. The Miracle Tour, I'll put it here 2009 to 2013, because on the 28th of January 2009, as you can see by the back of my shirt, I got to see him for the first time live at the Entertainment Center. There are DVDs, there are the countless things on YouTube from these tours. He went around the world. There were 3 separate tours around the world. It was absolutely, it was a triumph. Famously, I've got it here on the 28th of February 2009. I'm sorry, yeah. Simon Sweetman, who's the Dominion Post, the newspaper in Wellington in New Zealand, went to the concert. And he's their music critic and had been for many, many years. And he wrote a review, which is, you can still read it on the internet, it's so famous. He said, it's hard work having to put this concert into words, so I'll just say something I've never said in a review before and will never say again. This was the best show I have ever seen. When a critic says that, you realize you're at a different level. And it surely was. I know many people here also got to see those shows. Evie came with me to one of them, Davey came with me to one of them, of course Tracy to 4 of them. It was a sublime experience. He put together a team that was absolutely almost without match. I'll come back to that point. These 3 phenomenal women as backing singers, Sharon Robinson on your right, and then the Webb sisters, Charlotte and Hattie, Hattie and Charlotte, moving right to left, and then all of the various players, Neil Larson on the keyboards, Rafael Garda on drums, and so on. Dino Soldo you see with the sax, and in the front, bottom right, Javier Mas on the oud and archiloud. So it was an absolutely extraordinary experience. I'm going to tell one more anecdote which involves somebody in the room. I hope they don't mind. Too bad if they do. So this was 2009 that I saw the show. Later that year at Mariah, there was a situation and we needed to bring in somebody to teach for the rest of the year with us in our department. So we brought in one of the most famous maths teachers in New South Wales, a guy called Morris Needleman, who is in the front seat here. And so yeah, we got on, I thought, quite nicely, Morris and I. And one day I was sitting in our staff room and Morris was on the other side of the room. And I had some downtime, so I just Googled and I started playing I had headphones on, but I was playing some Leonard Cohen, one of these concerts. And Morris looked across and he said to me, "Oh, you like Leonard Cohen?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Me too." I said to him, "Did you go to the concert when he was here?" And he got a strange look on his face. And this has only happened to me once in my life. I knew exactly what he was going to say. I knew the sentence that was about to happen, because it's the sentence that I said when I came out of the show. "This is the nearest thing I've ever had to a religious experience." Morris turned to me, he said, "It's the nearest thing I've ever had to a religious experience." I loved Morris from that day to this. I knew we were soulmates. Never mind the maths. So there we go. Now, I'm now at the end of the first part. People can relax. We're going to have something else now. And the thing we're going to have is something absolutely remarkable, and I can promise you that. I said that this was the dream thing. Hi, Steve. Welcome aboard. I said that this was the dream band that he had. Not quite. Because a couple of months ago, I learned something new. I gave this same talk, or at least the first part of it, at the COA in Guevarra. And they first asked me, when they asked me to do the talk, would I also sing some Leonard Cohen songs? Clearly you've never heard me sing, we could put that to bed. I said, if there's a fire and you need to clear the place, I'll sing, no problem. But anyway, they said, "I'll get somebody." And they got somebody, who I met that night. They've got a guy called Lorenzo Guevarra. Young guy, he's 28, not Jewish, Sydney Sider, born and bred, who is a bigger Leonard Cohen tragic than I am. Lorenzo has just come back from Montreal. He went on a pilgrimage, I think that would be the right word, to Montreal.
I agree.
This is Lorenzo at Leonard Cohen's grave. And to my absolute delight, he has agreed to play for us tonight. Now, he played 3 songs that night. I've only heard one other person than Leonard Cohen who could play Leonard Cohen with the same feeling, and that's K.D. Lang, and I've heard 2. So Lorenzo's going to play with his brand new guitar, which he will tell you about.